The latest entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Eternals, is now in theaters. And I'm going to rank all 26 films in the MCU from worst to best. Well, right off the bat, in last place at number 26 is Eternals. This movie has no relatable characters. It jumps around the timeline too much. It's barely, if at all, connected to the MCU. Now, it's not completely unwatchable. There are some cool fight scenes, but overall the film was very dull. We don't get enough time with characters, so when they die, it means nothing. There are some good philosophical ideas in some of the writing regarding mankind and their choices, but overall I was left kind of bored for most of this movie. Number 25, The Incredible Hulk. Much like Eternals, this has barely any connection or importance to the other movies, but at least the story was mildly easy to follow. It was still a boring story, but I could at least follow what was going on. It was more linear. But Hulk isn't even Hulk for most of this movie. When you hear Incredible Hulk, you're expecting him to smash stuff. You're expecting him to go crazy. But most of this movie is just Bruce Banner brooding. Say that 5 times fast, because it sure was hard for me to say that. There's not really any action until the last 15 minutes, and on top of that, they set up Tim Blake Nelson to be a villain, but that still hasn't come back. And with Bruce Banner being played by a completely different actor in the rest of these movies anyway, this movie feels inconsequential and unimportant, except for the last 30 seconds of the movie where Tony Stark shows up. Number 24, Thor the Dark World. A story with a ton of rushed exposition and a dull, forgettable villain. The banter between Loki and Thor is good. The battles kind of feel like Lord of the Rings, but overall this movie's just bland and forgettable. Number 23, Captain Marvel. An uninteresting main character with a film that jumps all over the place. Little references to Ronan from Guardians of the Galaxy, the retro soundtrack from the 90s, and the comic relief alien animal just make this feel like if they had attempted to do something like Guardians of the Galaxy back in Phase 1. Now, if it had come out of Phase 1, or maybe even Phase 2, I wouldn't be as harsh on it, but because it is so close to Avengers Endgame, it feels like they went lazy on this one. It also answers questions nobody was asking, like, where did the name Avengers come from? How did Nick Fury lose his eye? Things like that is like, those aren't questions anybody was asking or even really wanted answers to, and the film answers them anyway, and it's pointless and stupid. Number 22, Thor. Kenneth Branagh did a great job directing this movie, but the story's pretty run-of-the-mill. Some of the fish-out-of-water humor works. Tom Hiddleston is great as Loki, but this isn't really an MCU movie I choose to rewatch outside of doing it for rankings. Number 21, Iron Man 2. An example of doing too much too soon. We need a movie to tide people over until Avengers, so let's just throw everything in here. Set up Black Widow. Set up the Avengers Initiative. Tony is dying. Whiplash is out for revenge. Justin Hammer is competing against Tony. It's just too much for one film, but there are some fun scenes. Any scene with Black Widow was a lot of fun, especially because they didn't tell you who she is right away. She's just some random employee that Stark hired. She has a mysterious past, which makes her an interesting character in this movie if you don't know who she is. But that's also the problem, is that Iron Man isn't even the star of his own movie. The only memorable and interesting stuff in this movie is Black Widow and Whiplash. Iron Man as a character just gets really sidelined in this movie. Number 20, Iron Man 3. I know a lot of people despise this movie. I still enjoy it. I know people had problems with the Trevor and Mandarin twist, but I thought it made sense, especially because in Winter Soldier it shows how shady organizations use pawns while the real masterminds work in the shadows. So it sets that up for that movie pretty well. Harley is a great character, and I liked what they did with Trevor Slatter after ShangChi. Number 19, Black Panther. There are some really cool action scenes and technology in this movie that make it seem like a spy movie, which is great. Killmonger is one of the best villains of the MCU, but if you take a look at some of the story elements, a lot don't work. A Wakandan society doesn't make a lot of sense. The beginning of the movie, they're so distrustful of each other that they send a spy to spy on their own spy. And they don't choose their leaders based on who's best for the people or the best morals or ethics. They choose them based on who's the strongest and most brutal in combat. And the end of the movie frustrates me because they're going to open Wakanda and share the resources, but you just had a civil war amongst yourselves. It has good action, but the story has a lot of problems. Number 18, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I really like this movie. It's a lot of fun, but I find a lot of humor in this one a lot more vulgar than the first film, and sometimes the jokes are made at moments they don't really need to be made. There's moments that should have a lot of emotional weight or should let the audience pause to process, but instead let's make a joke. Like there's a few lines that are really serious and we could go, oh, so that's what's going on. And instead of letting it sit and letting you process what you just heard and letting you feel the emotion of it, they decide right off the bat to make a joke, which kind of ruins the tone a little bit. Like, yeah, you need some lighthearted moments to counteract the darker ones, but not right away. that stuff should come near the end of the movie so that you do see the characters overcome the things about it that are negative. But doing it right away just feels like hand-holding. Number 17, Doctor Strange. There's definitely a lot of style to this movie. It has good character development. Stephen Strange starts out as this very narcissistic, unlikable jerk, very selfish, and then everything's taken from him, and he has to learn to rebuild himself and rely on others, and it's very great character development, but it's not one of my first choices for an MCU movie that I want to watch on my own. I still like it, just not as much as the other ones on this list. It's very stylized, has a great character, but not as good as the other ones on the list. Number 16, Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, I don't think this movie is as bad as everyone else says. James Spader is great as Ultron. They gave us Scarlet Witch, but I do agree that the film does slow down a bit to set up Civil War, and it isn't exciting. It isn't as exciting as maybe the first Avengers movie was. And also the Black Widow Bruce romance that is set up in this movie but never comes back, and also comes out of nowhere in this movie anyway. Like, no, this has always been a thing. Remember, like, no, we don't, because it was never a thing, and suddenly it's in the first 5 minutes of the movie, and then it never comes back anyway, so it's pointless and weird. Number 15, Iron Man. I'm not a fan of the character of Iron Man at all, but I will acknowledge that this is a well-made movie. It has a simple story that doesn't go too big, plays it serious enough to not be cringy, but it has enough fun to keep you entertained. It's still a solid film, even if Iron Man isn't a character I particularly like. Number 14, Guardians of the Galaxy. This is a very fun movie with very well fleshed out characters. The ensemble cast is great. All are flawed in their own way, but overcome their flaws, and they make you feel sympathy for a tree that only says, I am Groot. Number 13, Thor Ragnarok. The good Thor movie. It's bright, it's exciting, but I feel like Thor wasn't really the star of his own movie. Him teaming up with Hulk kind of sidelines him. Not a fan of Jeff Goldblum as Grandmaster. Not his acting performance. His performance is basically just him playing himself, just kind of the way that Ruth Kieran I was a really fan of. But I did like Hela. She was great. Kim Blanchett knocked it out of the park. Number 12, Spider-Man Far From Home. This is a great Spider-Man movie, but it does feel like, much like SpiderMan Homecoming, which I haven't gotten to on this list, he feels like he gets sidelined by Stark once again. The villain's motivations are revenge against Stark, and also the name they chose for the Spider-Sense felt a little too vulgar for a movie like this. And there's a very uncomfortable scene involving an adult female S.H.I.E.L.D. agent telling Peter, who is a teenager, to take off his clothes. Yeah, so he can put a new battle suit on, and Tom Holland is in his 20s when they filmed this, but the character is still in high school, and if the genders in this situation were swapped, yeah. Number 11, Shang-Chi. Now, I haven't gotten a chance to rewatch this recently. I only saw this movie once, and it was when it was in theaters, when it came out like 2 months ago. But it hits Disney Plus next week, so I'll get a chance to revisit it. So maybe my thoughts will change when I revisit it. But and also, so, you know, maybe when Spider-Man No Way Home is out, this will be higher on the list. But who knows? I still thought this movie was great. It had good fantasy elements. The mythology was well established and interesting. The fights were some of the most well choreographed in the MCU. I like how the Mandarin Iron Man 3 twist meant something for this film. Didn't really like Awkwafina as much. She wasn't as annoying as she could have been, but I just felt like she was trying to be funny, which is why it wasn't funny. And really, the only major reason it's not higher is just because I don't like this character as much as the other main characters that was higher up on this list, because this is only his first movie. Now, I like the character, I like what they did with him, but he hasn't really gotten a chance to grow or evolve yet. So maybe as we get more movies or more appearances from this character, it will get higher up on the list as I see who he becomes. So who knows? Number 10, Spider-Man Homecoming. Spidey's first solo outing in the MCU is a fun one. It feels like an 80s teen movie. Michael Keaton is great as the villain. Tom Holland is perfectly cast as Spidey. But it does feel like, once again, he's being sidelined by Iron Man. Iron Man's sort of the side character in this movie. So Spider-Man just kind of feels like an afterthought. It feels like Tony Stark kind of monopolizes a lot of the movie, as opposed to the other Spider-Man movies before this, where he was very much the focus. He feels like kind of an afterthought, especially because the villain's motivations aren't against Peter like the other ones. They're against Stark. So, probably could have been stronger in some of those elements. Number 9, AntMan. A bit of a different flavor to the MCU. A heist film with a character who, unlike a lot of the other characters list, doesn't start out as a good person. He's a criminal, but he's doing criminal acts for altruistic reasons, but the reasons of doing it are still good. He's not doing it because he enjoys being evil, but he's still a criminal. But he's still extremely likable. It also has one of the funniest MCU films. Great character development with Scott Lang, but much like Scott Lang, it steals too much from Iron Man 1. The story steals way too much, just like Scott Lang. Number 9, Ant-Man and the Wasp. The sequel that's even funnier and a better story. More emotion, more fleshed out relationships. Louis coming back, he's always funny. Very great film, much more interesting than the first one. Number 7, Black Widow. This is the movie Incredibles 2 should have been, because what Incredibles 2 did was take everything about the first movie that was interesting, which was a superhero family, and throw that to the side just so Elastigirl could be the star, and it became more of an Elastigirl movie. This is what Incredibles 2 should have been. More of the superhero family, more of this dynamic, very well done. It felt like Incredibles mixed with Mission Impossible. Every cast member had a great dynamic. An interesting story with a great villain. I know a lot of people had problems with what they did with Taskmaster, but I thought it made sense in the context of the story. It didn't feel completely out of nowhere. It felt like they set it up. I thought it was pretty well done. Number 6, Captain America, the First Avenger. What's great about this film is the main character is just an ordinary man. Unlike the previous films that came out before this, he's not a billionaire genius. He isn't even a regular genius. He's not a god. He's just a man who wants to do the right thing, but life and his circumstances have kind of set him back, but he finally gets the chance, and the 1940s setting is done very well. Number 5, Captain America Civil War. For the most part, I like this movie. The airport scene is one of the best battle scenes in the MCU. The script is fantastic, never taking one side for one side or the other, never telling you Cap is right or Iron Man is right. It's letting you kind of choose who you want, though I personally am Team Cap. But I have 3 problems with this movie. 1, it makes no sense for Black Widow to be on Team Iron Man, especially because other movies aside, if you just watch it as Captain America the First Avenger, Captain America the Winter Soldier, and then Captain America Civil War, and then Black Widow basically, goes on bounds off on Capitol Hill as they phrase it in that movie. It makes no sense for Black Widow to suddenly be on Team Iron Man, which even the movie points out, and they're just kind of like, let's just roll with it. I don't know. I feel like they did that just so they could have a balance, and they didn't really have any other characters where it makes sense. They just kind of were like, And also, the way they introduced Spider-Man is kind of weird because Aunt May lets grown man Tony Stark, who is a stranger to her, into her teenage nephew's room alone. And also, said adult man then goes with teenage boy and tells him to lie to Aunt May about where he is. I don't know. There's some problems. Aunt May is kind of a terrible guardian. And also, Cap is kissing his niece. That's another problem I have with this. Number 4, Captain America the Winter Soldier, the film that completely broke the superhero genre as we know it in the best way possible. It's a Tom Clancy-esque thriller with a great villain, and Captain America and Black Widow have great chemistry, which is why he should have ended up with Black Widow instead of Peggy, because he's kissing his niece. Number 3, Avengers. The ensemble cast is great, especially because it is their first time all together in the same movie. Very witty script, still holds up. Maybe the action isn't as upscale as maybe some of the later entries, but for the time, this was a really good movie that knocks it out of the park, and it still holds up really well today. Number 2, Avengers Endgame. An almost perfect finale to all the characters that have been established up to this point, but I do have a few problems with it. Like I said many times before, you know where I'm going with this. Cap going back to live with Peggy means he's kissing his niece, as I've reiterated several times. I'm kind of a broken record at this point. And also, all the female characters on this huge planet just all happen to be in one place at one time. That seems very unnaturally contrived. So other than those 2 gripes, still a really fantastic finale, though. They knocked out the park with this. Number 1, Avengers Infinity War. Great pacing, great cast, great villain. One of the best villains in cinematic history. Not just superheroes, just in cinematic history. Thanos was fantastic. Josh Brolin was terrifying. Every cast member got every beat right. The story was fantastic. Had a very shocking ending that left us wondering what was going to happen up until Endgame came out. Still an amazing payoff. And it comes in at number 1 as the best MCU movie. It's going to share your ranking of all 26 MCU movies. You can include the shows if you want. I didn't, just because the shows are kind of separate, their own thing. Not really sure how to rank them in a movie list. But, maybe as we get more shows into a show ranking, I don't know. But I will see you in the next video.